Hi folks, it's Thibaut Van Dam here with another YouTube video. And for those of you who are not familiar with my channel, I am a DIY singer-songwriter and guitar tutor based in Southeast London. And today I'm very excited to be back on my channel talking about music theory and practical guitar. And I was away from my channel for a little bit, so I just want to take just a second just to talk about why. Even though it's sort of vague, it was sort of for personal reasons, but also unfortunately on Monday I found out I have COVID basically, and I've sort of just been recovering from that. And ironically, this gave me the kind of downtime I needed to basically work out what was going on with this video, because the reality is that I was trying to make this video for quite a while, and as soon as I was supposed to, sort of the week after, because I try to make these videos every Sunday, and I made a version and I made a bunch of different takes, and then I waited a week and I was like, I'm not sure why I'm not going ahead with this. And weirdly, in this sort of COVID fugue I've been in, I realized that this video that I'm about to do right now, this video about the CAGED system, is kind of a whole new method to learning how to play guitar from what I was teaching previously. So the previous videos I've done were very theoretical. I wasn't really showing how to play chords, you might have noticed. And the CAGED system confronts playing chords, but it's also a mindset on how to start thinking about playing chords and also key signatures in a very specific kind of physical, practical way. And I realized that there were huge implications by embarking on this video, because the results were that the subsequent videos I'll be making after this video are going to be a lot more sort of practically focused, and it's going to be finally that beautiful synthesis that I love so much about this instrument and playing guitar, which is where theory and kind of practice kind of overlap and become sort of one and the same, and things get pretty interesting. So if this sounds interesting to you, please definitely consider liking the video. Please consider subscribing to the channel. It is the best way to stay up to date with the content I'm making. And of course, it is the type of thing that makes me motivated to keep coming back to my channel, to keep making these videos. God knows I don't make any money from it, so it's definitely the sort of thing that makes me feel like as long as people are watching, there's value to what I'm doing. So thank you to all the people that do subscribe. I did, of course, see some people were subscribing in the time I was away from the channel making videos. Thank you to those people. It definitely cheered me up. It made me feel like I should come back. It made me feel responsible, accountable for this channel, which I am. And that's why I'm here today making this video right now. So without further ado, let's get into it. We're going to talk about the CAGED system, and I mentioned that it's a practical approach to learning chords, so we'll sort of confront that first, and then I want to take a little time to just talk about the implications of the CAGED system. And in a way, the CAGED system is sort of just a practical approach to learning guitar, and I have to say I came across the CAGED system multiple times over the years, and in the first instance, it is really just about learning basic open major chords. But what became evident to me as I started to explore different chords was that there's sort of a physical connectedness between certain chord voices and stuff. And learning how to sort of think about the CAGED system in a physical, practical way is like a eureka moment for sure, because it sort of opens up the possibilities of what you're actually able to do on the instrument, regardless of how much you actually understand about what you're doing. And that's just freaking amazing. So these are sort of the things I'll be talking about. And along the way, I want to have a conversation, or like kind of a monologue, I guess, about universality, that great idea again. So these are sort of the things that I'll be talking about in this video. So just to start with, the CAGED system is actually an acronym. And lo and behold, it stands for C, A, G, E, and D. And those are the chords that we learn when we learn the CAGED system. Now, if you are anything like me, you might already be learning songs. This is how I started over 10 years ago. I would go on Ultimate Guitar or other websites like that, and I would just find a song that I want to learn, like Thick as a Brick by Jethro Tull or something, and I would just start playing whatever I saw in the tablature or the chords. And that's how I learned certain chords. And there was no clear framework. And so the CAGED system is a framework that we learn each of the chords by. So the first chord we learn is, of course, C major, followed by A major. We also learn A minor. We'll learn G major. We'll learn E major. and E minor. And finally, we'll learn D major, and we'll also learn D minor. And you might notice that I omitted certain minor chords. And this is because those chords, when they're played in the open position, present harmonic contradictions, which I know I feel like I'm being a snob, but it's true. For example, if I play G minor in an open position, it actually sounds really interesting. It's sort of bluesy. That's because we have both a minor third and a major third. So one of the subsequent videos that I'm going to be making after this is a video about how to construct chords. And just like we talked about with the major scale, it is actually very formulaic. Major chords all follow the same formula. So even though there are tons of major chords, they all have that same kind of formula to it. Same with minor chords, and if you can see where I'm going with this, a lot of chords with different voicings, like dominant chords, they all have little formulas that you can follow. And so no matter where you start, if you want to play a chord that starts with this note, G sharp, if you know you want it to be minor, you follow the formula, you construct the minor version of this. Or if you know that you want it to be a major seventh, well, then you construct the formula. And this idea of the formula, well, it's part of why music is formulaic, because people like me love to spend time just, over analyzing stuff and figuring things out. But it's one of the things that also makes playing, practically speaking, very easy. So one of the other videos that I'll be looking at after this one is also sort of the way we think about extensions. So there will be videos you can expect of chord extensions. Some of the ones I've just mentioned, like for instance, dominant or major seventh, would be some of those videos you can anticipate. So that just about does it. So I'll be making videos on each and every single one of those chords, and specifically talking about which fingers to fret with. I'll be referring back to, of course, the video I already made about how to correctly fret. But this is sort of where we start to embark on actually learning the chords and strumming along and trying to do things. Something else I want to talk about is the fact that I mentioned that these are open chords. So the idea of a chord being open is based on the principle that you can strum indiscriminately through the strings to create your chord. And for the most part, this is true, save for the example of D major, where you really sort of don't want to hit the A string or the E string or the A string, because it sort of changes the character of the chord slightly. And it's also worth pointing out that we're talking about chords in the first position. There are other chords that are open chords like that, which are not really in that first position. I call that sort of a first position or primary position. It's the only position I really think about, because those chords C, A, G, E, and D, they all appear sort of within the first 3 frets on the neck of the guitar. And actually, I had a friend growing up, a guy named Matt, and he had this really like crazy old guitar. I think it was a Gibson. I think it was the Gibson. I think it said the Gibson on the top. But that just might just be my rose-tinted glasses. But I just remember that I think it belonged to his grandfather, and he only played in that position, and all the frets were like totally fine, but this was just done for, just kaput. It had so many nail marks in it, totally worn in, just in that position. So I think that's sort of what I'm getting to here. Now that we talked about the practicalities of the CAGED system and where we're going to sort of go with it in terms of pathway, the next thing I wanted to talk about is sort of this idea of universality and how it ties into the CAGED system. So universality is an idea I've mentioned many times on this channel because it's just so simple and beautiful. It's what makes music kind of fair and just, which I also freaking love about it. Not that I want to get into the politics of music, but it is a thing that exists. Music seems really fair and universal in that sense. So of course, if music is the language that connects us all, then music is in fact a universal thing from its very foundation. So the first level that we saw the idea of universality in theory was with the chromatic scale, right? So the chromatic scale accounts for every note from A to G sharp and back. And in total, we end up with these 12 tones. And so each note is following something called equal temperament, which means that every note is of equivalent value to every other note. And it's almost hard to think about the time before this, because this is a recent concept. it's difficult to imagine when it wasn't like that. For example, where like, I don't know, F was somehow of more value or substantial bearing than like, I don't know, G or something. That's hard to imagine for me. So the idea here, especially with guitar, because as you look at the frets, they get more narrow as they go progressively down the neck. So the impression you might get is that somehow these notes are like, they're different. We would say they're different than these notes, but actually they're different in the sense the pitch is higher, but that's not to suggest that the value or the worth or, you know, the use case of the notes is somehow less or valued more greatly or whatever, that each note is equal. And in that sense, whatever you can do with one note, you can do with any of the other notes. So that's the first example where we saw universality. The next instance where we saw universality was the subsequent concept of intervals. And to recap, the idea of intervals is that we characterize the amount of space between any two notes. And so because we're talking about space between notes, my best example that I love to give is here on this ruler. Hopefully you can see that this ruler has, well, it has inches and it has centimeters and everything, but we're just gonna look at the inches, and you can see here, this is inch 0 to 1, inch 1 to 2, inch 2 to 3, and so on, right? And the idea here is that inch 1 is of the same length as inch 1 to 2, right? 0 to 1 is the same inch length as, I don't know, 4 to 5. This inch is equal to that inch, which is equal to that inch, and so it goes. And when we calculate it, I mean, of course, we need to know which number we start on. For instance, if for some reason you were measuring something from 12 to 7, and you were saying, well, how long is that? You would have to account for the number 12 and the number 7, and that's no different. It's all the exact same with intervals. And the beautiful thing about this is that, for example, the amount of space between 0 and 2 is 2 inches, and so is the amount of space between, say, 4 and 6. And so music operates wonderfully in this exact same way, and it works greatly to our advantage. So the example I can give here is the major second, which happens to be 2 semitones. So, for example, E to F sharp is a major second interval, but we can also hear a major second interval if we play the note F sharp and play the following note G sharp. G sharp is also the same distance away as F sharp is from E. So this is how we sort of start to think of universality according with intervals. Now, universality therefore also subsequently appears in the idea of scales, because what are scales? F not sequential intervals, right? So a scale is just a series of notes that are separated by a set amount of distance between each and every note. Sometimes you'll find you get a half step, or you'll get a whole step. And so usually when we talk about it, we'll say, well, we have root, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, something like that. And that happens to be the major scale pattern. And so scales sort of have that universality too. For example, if we play the G major scale, that is the G major scale. If we take that physical pattern I just did, and we just started here, well, that happens to be the A major scale. And the only reason it's A major is because we started on the root note A. But if you look closely at just the movement of my fingers, and you might have noticed that actually the patterns are just literally copied and pasted. And therein lies the origin of sort of where we start to see the CAGED system fit into place. And it's super exciting. I'm really excited about it. So when we play this idea of the major scale and how we can just sort of copy and paste that version right over here, we can do that with any note. We could have done it with the note in between. That's also a major scale. So the idea here is that we can sort of start moving scales around too. And this is where the CAGED system fits in. So universality, of course, therefore applies to chords, but specifically to chord shapes. So for example, at some point down the line, if you are following the method that I did to learn songs and learn guitar, you might have come across a chord like C sharp minor, and it looks like this. And it sounds like this. And hopefully before then, you would have encountered the chord A minor. And if you play each of these chords and you sort of juxtapose them, what you can see they have in common, while some of the notes, in fact, necessarily, maybe not all of the notes, maybe none of the notes, I can't even think about it right now, while they might not have a lot in common in a technical sense, when you actually look at the chord shapes, this kind of looks like a little boot, I don't know, and well, so does that, right? So if these both share this kind of physical shape, well, this is a minor shape. Specifically, I like to call this the A minor shape. Now, so if I play a chord like this, I would describe it as having an A minor shape. This is because it originates from that first A minor chord. And this is just super exciting because when we look at this, we find that actually they both are minor chords. So this is a minor chord, and so is this, and so is this, and so is this. This is minor, this is a minor chord. And I know that as long as I keep that shape, I can physically move around the neck, playing these chords, and getting that amazing result of just the same character of chord. And this is where things start to heat up, because when we play a major chord, for instance, you'll probably also encounter a chord like A major, and if not already, definitely in the subsequent CAGED system videos I'll be making, this is the A major chord. Now, if I take this chord and I slide it back up to that note C sharp, well, this is a C sharp major. And all I'm doing is sliding the physical shape of the chord up and down the neck. This is a major chord, and so is this, and so is this. And this is just the most amazing thing, because what that means is you can play a character of a chord simply because you know the shape of it, but you don't actually have to know the name of the chord yet. Specifically, you won't have to know the root. You'll know that it's major, but I don't have to think about what note that is until I really feel like it. So there's still something very magical and also equally very theoretical about what we're doing here. And this is super exciting. So then this idea can get extended to also chord extensions, right? So not only does the idea of this CAGED system start to fit into place with major and minor chords, but with, say, minor seventh, or major seventh, or dominant. If you know those formulas, you can start moving that shape around. And so then the next advanced level, and this is something that we haven't actually talked about yet on the channel, is the idea of key signatures. So I've probably alluded to this in the past, but when we talked about the major scale, the idea of a key signature is that every note in a major scale has an assignable chord. So it stands to reason that if these are the notes in a scale, that each of those notes has a subsequent chord that goes with it. And so on. And the idea is that, would you believe it, that the idea of transferability, universality, applies not only to scales and chords, but also to key signatures. And so to demonstrate this, I'll just play the key signature of E. So this is the E major chord, and the key signature would follow through like this. This is just sort of the first four chords of that key signature. And if we want, and we happen to know the order of those chords as being either major or minor, we can actually follow that pattern to another level, where we can actually physically take this chord as a major chord and follow the same physical movements, not only between the notes, but between the characters of the chords, to therefore move the entire key signature too. And that's a little bit more advanced, but this would be totally invaluable if you needed to change keys, for instance, in the event that you couldn't sing a certain song. If you were trying to sing in E, but it was just so low for some reason, you can't sing that, or it's too high or something. Well, you could say, well, what if we started here? We'll play it in G sharp major instead. You can still yield that same result. So this is how also transposing would work. And this is also super helpful later on when we start talking about the circle of fifths and the idea of being able to borrow chords or use other chords, because it'll help you locate where those chords actually are. And of course, this is super helpful if you're trying to learn the neck of the instrument, where certain notes are. You'll find, especially with every CAGED system, that there are repeats of chords. For instance, you'll see a C major chord here, but also another one here. So that's pretty exciting. So this is just the most exciting part, I think, about learning guitar, when the theoretical things start to intertwine with a lot of the practical playing. And so these are things that we'll talk about. I will, of course, talk about the method to which we create a key signature, because it's something that I think if you assume you know how key signature is formed, or if you just remember the pattern of major and minor chords, you can memorize it, sure. But I think when you understand why it's constructed the way it is, then you are able to navigate the idea of a major scale and then major key signature a little bit more differently, with a little bit more nuanced information about it. So these are a lot of the different topics that I'll be talking about in subsequent videos after this one. This was supposed to just be an introductory video talking about the CAGED system and its benefits. And then I guess the final thing I just have to conclude on is that the reason we learn the CAGED chords now, going back to that original rudimentary idea, why do we learn C? Why do we learn A major and A minor? It's because if you know those shapes, those physical shapes, those are all the open physical shapes you can play. Then when you transpose, when you start to move the chords around to create, major chords or minor chords or whatever, that the shapes are likely to be replicated. And that's what's so exciting. And that's why we learn those chords specifically. We learn C major because if you need to play a D sharp, but you need to do a certain cadence, you'll know that this is the major version of that chord, and that's the note D sharp. So if you had to play that cadence, and your song is in C, but you can't sing in C, or you want to hear what it sounds like in D sharp, or I guess E flat, then you might want to play it in this shape. And this is because certain chord shapes, and when I say shapes, I mean literally this shape, this kind of slashy shape, or this kind of shape, which is kind of a triangle. When I know it sounds like I'm a child here, but like when you think about it in that shape, if you know the implications of the shape in terms of major and minor, then what it means is you have certain advantages. For example, it's really easy to play the 1-7-6 cadence, a thing we'll talk about also in subsequent videos, that it's easier to play it like a C than it is to play it like a D. In fact, I would have to really take a minute just to think about how to do it. But to do it in C, in the C shape, that's easier. And likewise, every other chord has its own sort of advantage. For example, if you're playing in D major, certain D major shaped chords allow for suspensions very easily, whereas C doesn't really allow for that as much. Or for instance, A allows for a really nice minimalist ascension. And if you needed to move any of those kind of cadences around, well, you could do it using this CAGED system in Barre Chords. And so if you're able to think about which chord shape would benefit you most, you can strategize to move things around in a far more practical way. I guess also one other thing that I also haven't mentioned is Barre chords. In order to use the CAGED system in this way, Barre chords are going to be an absolutely essential way of doing that. You won't have to do full bars all the time, but you will need to know how to play certain Barre chords. And I will say that there are different techniques to doing it, but I'll make a separate video about it anyway, because there are certain ways to make it a little bit easier. And so I think that finally covers everything that I meant to talk about in this video. I hope that you found it informative and helpful. If you did, please, of course, give me a thumbs up. Please consider subscribing to the channel. It's the best way to stay up to date with the things I make. And of course, it will keep you in the loop. And it will, of course, also motivate me. It'll keep me coming back to the channel, making all these videos that I'm saying I'm going to do. And I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. Thanks to all the people that do subscribe. And I will see you at the next one. Ciao for now.